I have spent hours testing all 23 red tools in Silksong to bring you the most comprehensive coverage you will ever watch of just how well they actually perform, what kind of secret functions they have built into them, and the numbers to back up the claims, especially since many tools have been secretly nerfed since the initial release of the game. And a huge thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Some of the tools in Silksong are downright disgusting, while others leave much to be desired. Some have become crowd favorites either through word of mouth, or simply because they appear to be putting in work visually so we get the impression that they're strong. But we deal with objective evidence here, and when you take a proper look at the results, you'll be surprised at just how much worse some are than you were initially led to believe. So I hope this opens your eyes to some of the more neglected or lesser known tools in the game. Welcome to another installment in the Silksong Handbook. When it comes to the rankings, I'll be evaluating each tool on 3 metrics: strength, consistency, and versatility. Strength encompasses the total damage you could deal with a full set of a given tool, along with how fast you can dish it out, and is easily the most significant factor in the overall rankings here. I'll also mention if there are any special blue tool interactions that enhance its performance disproportionately, such as the quick sling or polyp pouch, as some benefit significantly more from these than others. Consistency examines, you guessed it, how consistently you could actually land all of your hits with it. And this is incredibly important to consider alongside strength, as some tools have massive damage ceilings, but a horribly low likelihood of ever hitting it, even if you're an exceptionally good player. Finally, versatility looks at how useful the tool is across multiple scenarios in the game. For example, can it be used in any boss fight, or is it only viable against ground-bound bosses? And is it something that's worth using in general exploration? While somewhat strength related, if the tool has piercing or AoE explosion capabilities, then this is another point in favor of versatility that's also worth factoring in. A final separate consideration is the difficulty of using each tool, which is somewhat related to consistency, but is more just examining the skill level required to get the most out of a tool, and I think that's worth highlighting outside of the core ranking itself. As always, tell me if I should be slapped like new for some of my takes. The discussion for the Crest analysis video has been awesome so far, and the overwhelming majority have been civilized and thoughtful, which I greatly appreciate. There have been some excellent, eye-opening perspectives shared that really highlight the less understood strengths of each crest, so thank you all for your contributions. Hopefully we get the same thing here too. My take on the Beast Crest Pogo was especially harsh, and I can definitely see the case for how strong it can be when used correctly after playing around with it a little bit more and hearing all of your thoughts. While I was mostly joking about how awful it is just because I needed something to get a bad ranking, I will die on the hill that it remains the most frustrating Pogo in the game to master, and that they should really change the initial wind-up frames to be possible to instant Pogo instead of forcing you to take damage. That's just my 2 cents. In any case, as per usual, I'll mark any important amendments as necessary in the pinned comments. A quick note about features shared by all tools before we get started here. While it's pretty clear that there are 4 upgrades for both tool pouch size and crafting kits to up the damage when looking at the menu, it's less clear what the actual change to those numbers are, so let's clear that up quickly. Typically, a tool pouch will increase the capacity of the tool by 25%, though rounding will impact this in some cases, but when you get all 4 tool pouch upgrades, you will always end up with twice the initial starting capacity. So 3 charges goes to 6, and 12 charges would go to 24. As for crafting kits, you'll get what is supposed to be a 60% additive damage bonus multiplied against the base of the tool, again with rounding impacting this in certain cases. So you could expect a weapon that does 10 base damage to then do 16, 22, 28, and finally 34 damage at max rank. The exceptions to this rule include Flintslate to a minor degree, Fleabrew, and the Plasmium Phial, which are not affected by this at all. For simplicity and consistency, I'll be only using numbers that reference fully upgraded tools, so we have apples to apples comparisons. Finally, all tools have the exact same shard cost to replenish a full set, regardless of how much ammo they have, with the exception of Fleabrew and the Rosary Cannon, which have their own replenish functions. A tool with the baseline pouch size costs 40 shards to refill, while the max one costs 80. I've put up a simple breakdown of the shard cost per tool throw based on the ammo capacity, in case you were curious about that at all. Tools with the highest total damage per set are the most cost-efficient tools to run, regardless of how fast they can be dished out. With shared features out of the way, we are ready to dig into some tools and see what actually comes out on top. I'm going to keep the order of the tools the same as how they appear in the tools menu, which somewhat follows the general order you could expect to obtain them. However, the last 4 tools get lumped at the bottom, likely because they're either temporary tools or charge-based buffing tools like Flintslate and Fleabrew. First on the list is the straight pin, and it is likely the first tool you will come by in the game, and it's just about as straightforward as any tool is going to get. You literally just throw the pin straight ahead in the direction you're facing, and you deal 17 damage to the first target you hit, and there's no penetration or AoE. In terms of total damage output, this is almost the worst tool in the game, with only 3 coming in worse than it, which is honestly fair, as it would be kinda OP to get a cracked tool right out of the gates, right? Sting Shard. What the hell was that? The only real saving grace for this tool is that you really won't have many better options to use in the earliest stages of the game, and it'll likely out DPS your needle until you've upgraded it at least once. So you may as well take advantage of the high ammo capacity it has and the long range you can use it from to knock out airborne and low HP enemies. For the early game, and I'm talking about like the first hour or two of the game, it's a fair play to run, but the second you get basically any other tool, this thing goes from straight pin to straight poo. And I'd say it's fair to call this a D tier tool, to be honest, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. Strength-wise, it's horrible, but it's very consistent at landing all its damage, albeit a minuscule amount. And versatility-wise, you do get about the same performance from it wherever you use it, but it's bad everywhere you use it, so yeah, not much more to be said here. Difficulty-wise, I'd call it a 1 out of 10. Just throw it. As a bit of an aside, surprisingly, I don't think this is quite an F tier tool, because you can actually make use of the polyp pouch with this better than almost any other tool in the game, simply because of the fact that no matter what tool you pair it with, you do the exact same amount of poison damage, meaning low damage, high ammo capacity weapons benefit the most from it, with the exception of Flintslate, which is actually very different, and I'll explain that later. Otherwise, in all circumstances, any actual weapon tool will apply poison for 2 ticks of damage, with multi-hit tools reapplying the poison with subsequent hits if a poison damage tick has gone off already, making the Tacks and Cogflys particularly nice to pair with it too. So low ammo, high capacity big hitters like the Pimpillo or Voltvessels, which are great for whomping enemies, will have a very minuscule change in the total damage percentage they do, while the straight pin and similar tools can see damage increases of 30 to 40%, and in one very unique case, almost double damage output. So you can actually just toss a pin every couple of seconds to get that full potency of the poison up while doing damage with your needle or silk skills before throwing the next one, which is why it's not an F. Second is the threefold pin, which brings 3 times the projectiles compared to the straight pin, but not quite 3 times the damage. You'll fire the pins in a small spread, with the first being straight, the second being 10 degrees, and the third being 20. Now in terms of damage, you'll do 14 damage for hitting a single pin, 7 more for the second or half of the base hit, then the third will do 4 or a third of the base hit, for a potential total of 25 damage per hit, though this will be tougher to execute in practice against small enemies, and especially so if you're not barrel stuffing them. That being said, you still get reasonable damage for hitting only 1 or 2 of the pins, and you're given significantly more flexibility in your ability to fight enemies at different heights without necessarily having to be airborne to do so. So from a strength perspective, it's definitely on the weaker side, coming in at 17th and 15th place, and consistency wise, I'd say you're pretty unlikely to get more than 80% of your full damage off without being very disciplined about using it point blank, which is kind of trash because that means you'd likely be in needle range and could just be whacking for equivalent or greater DPS while generating silk too, unless the enemy is massive and can be hit from further away. For versatility, you at least have those options of hitting airborne enemies pretty easily, and it's fair play in any boss fight, so that's a plus. It's also another tool that could benefit from the polyp pouch given the high ammo capacity, however the damage is significantly lacking regardless of that, so I don't think I can really put it any higher than a C-. Difficulty wise, I'd say it's definitely harder to master than the straight pin and requires discipline to max the DPS out, so I'd call it a 4 out of 10, but nothing crazy. Alright, now this is where things get especially spicy, and honestly I didn't realize just how massively OP the Sting Shard was until I did proper testing with it. So there are actually 2 ways in which the Sting Shard functions, and the one that most people are probably familiar with is the jabbing attack that initiates when a set Sting Shard gets triggered by an enemy contacting it, and that's okay in terms of damage, dealing 5 hits of 7 damage and falling in at rank 15 in DPS, but only 19th in total damage, which isn't great, but this does sort of stun lock enemies when they're caught in it, which does have value on top of being AoE damage. However, if you were to instead hit a set Sting Shard, it will detonate and release 6 spikes that each deal 14 damage for up to a massive 84 damage from a single shot if all spikes hit, making it capable of one-shotting a huge percentage of enemies in the game. Now this is obviously only going to happen when an enemy is basically sitting on top of the shard, but you can absolutely get this to happen in boss fights when they're stunned, or have just finished a combo if you have a relatively stationary enemy. Here's a crazy way to combo the Sting Shards to get an absolutely obscene 188 DPS just from the shards. Simply throw 2 Sting Shards out and then immediately follow up with 2 basic attacks, and you should be able to perfectly sync the timing so that they detonate instead of going into jab mode, at least for crests with 2 attacks per second attack speed. You may need to add a tiny delay on faster crests like the Wanderer. If you're too lazy to get that technical, you can do what I call the 50-50 method, where just throwing 2 Sting Shards on top of each other on an enemy forces the first to jab, but will guarantee that the second gets popped. If you just chuck literally all of them at once, you can sometimes get lucky and pop multiple on an enemy, but when you do the full blast method, you end up getting the 4th highest damage and DPS of any tool in the game, which is pretty insane for a tool you can get very early into a playthrough. Doing the 50-50 method is also still the 5th highest DPS in the game and the 10th highest total damage, so you don't even have to try especially hard to get pretty incredible results. I think this tool is very versatile and works in just about any combat scenario. That said, the consistency factor for getting the maximum potential out of it is probably its greatest weakness, as it's incredibly difficult to get max damage blasts off if your timing isn't great, and it's almost impossible against enemies that are in motion no matter how skilled you are. Also, if you aren't careful, you could inadvertently detonate a shard you set up with the intent to do the jabbing attack on, as it's more reliable against small enemies. But now you've blown it up and will probably hit only 1 or 0 spikes. Realistically, I'd say the average player would be lucky to get half of the Sting Shard's maximum potential damage off by using it normally, and maybe closer to 75% for a skilled player executing the blast method relatively consistently. If a boss is stunned though, just about anybody can go to town on it with these and have consistent results. All things considered, as much as I'd like to put it in the S+ Shaw tier, I'm only going to give it an S, as the consistency factor on this for general use is a pretty solid hit against it, though very skilled players can get around it to a degree. I'm honestly going to call this an 8 out of 10 in difficulty, because you can very easily botch your shots if you're not careful, and learning what windows are fair game for a clean full blast combo will take some time. It's still really strong generally though, so grab this thing ASAP in your playthrough if you want to shred through just about anything you come across. If launching supercharged ordnance at the bugs of Harloom isn't enough to scratch that itch for engaging, explosive combat, then look no further. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made and is available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile. Take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, spanning across over a century of evolution and vehicular warfare. One of my favorite War Thunder features is X-Ray View, which gives you a comprehensive breakdown of exactly what led to the destruction of you or your enemy's vehicle. You'll see precisely where a shell penetrated and the components that were affected in real time, giving you powerful information to use in future battles. Immerse yourself in the intense combat, incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects that culminate into an experience that puts you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of the modern age. Join a growing worldwide community of over 95 million players in epic PvP battles today, and delve into the exhilarating experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no better game suited for fans of military history. Dive right into the action and play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile using my links in the description and pinned comment for a supercharged start. If you're a new or returning player who hasn't played in the last 6 months on PC and consoles, you'll receive a massive bonus package that includes the exclusive Vehicle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100k Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, multiple premium vehicles, and more. This offer is available for a limited time only, so don't miss your chance to grab it. So the Tacks are absolutely a crowd favorite tool, and for very good reasons, similar to the Sting Shard. However, I have some unfortunate news to share with you all. Our precious Tacks have been shadow nerfed. Originally, they used to drop 5 Tacks that would deal 2 instances of 7 damage each, but now you only get 4 per toss, so an effective 20% damage nerf. To be honest, this was kind of justified because the Tacks are stupidly strong and even still maintain the number 6 slot in terms of DPS, though their total damage rank has dropped down to 13. The beauty of the Tacks is the set it and forget it nature, so once they're down, you can just go to town as long as you're thinking about luring the boss over to them. Then the damage is all but guaranteed to land, assuming they don't have any tool destroying capabilities like Trobio's tornadoes. Now, while that's theoretical, in practice I found it distinctly harder to actually get all tack damage off in general exploration. Usually time to kill is so low that many enemies will be dead before they can even be hit by a couple of tack hits, let alone a full set. Unless the enemy is incredibly large and moves around enough to get hit by the tacks frequently, you're gonna get a lot less real damage from these than other tools. Also, despite it being possible for the Polyp Pouch to continually reapply poison from the tacks, this won't be especially useful in practice, as you're usually trying to dump your max of 4 tack sets all in one spot for a boss to get quickly nuked, so you'll have to stagger things out if you want to see any real benefits from it, and even then I don't think it's worth giving up a blue slot for. Overall, I'd say they're still a really strong pick against ground-bound bosses and large enemies, but outside of that, they're really not going to perform especially well. In addition to the fact that they don't deal true AoE damage, as each individual attack can only damage a single enemy at a time. For those reasons, I'm actually only going to call them a B+ overall, especially after the nerfs, though don't let that stop you from using them on bosses specifically, as that's more of an A+. Difficulty-wise, it's not really complicated. I'd say it's a 2 out of 10 only because you do need to lure enemies to the tacks and need to be aware of what can destroy them in fights. fights. So the Longpins are an interesting weapon, and while they're pretty weak, coming in almost dead last in terms of DPS and total damage, they do have the unique ability to pierce through any armor. So the shield-bearing judges in the Blasted Steps, the horn beetles in the Memoriam, and a couple others will take full damage from the Longpin. Each pin does 17 damage and fires in a nice arc that pierces through multiple enemies, making them solid for clearing piles of trash mobs. They will still, however, be deflected by enemies that are parrying, and I was hopeful that this wouldn't be the case, as it would make them a little more enticing to use. I'd say they're reasonably versatile because of the AoE, and with the arc that it has, it makes hitting airborne enemies pretty easy along with bosses. Consistency-wise, I do think it's very simple to land every shot, but similar to the straight pin, it's really just lacking in the damage department, so in spite of all its benefits, it's hard to call this anything higher than a C-, with the AoE and the very situationally useful armor pen being the only reason I'm not putting it lower. I'd say it's a 2 out of 10 to master just because it will take a couple throws to get used to that arc trajectory. Alright, now the Longpin wasn't especially remarkable, but the Curveclaw absolutely is. For a weapon you get super early into the game, this is another incredible pick for anyone willing to put in the time to master this powerhouse of a weapon. For calculating the max total damage and DPS on the Curveclaw, I figured 5 hits per toss was a reasonable number to use, as most medium-sized enemies can be hit this many times, while bigger enemies can be hit a little more, and smaller enemies a little bit less, which brings you up to an average of 50 damage per toss, and 7th in both DPS and total damage rankings, which is pretty damn good. Not only can you do a very large amount of damage to a single target, but you can hit as many enemies as you want that are unlucky enough to come in contact with a Curveclaw, and for all intents and purposes, this has no limit on the number of hits it can do before breaking, which I don't think is actually even possible, which is not the same for other weapons we haven't covered yet, that does hamper their damage potential quite a bit. I think this is a very versatile weapon considering it gets tossed out at ground level while returning at airborne level, so it covers all level of the battlefield with ease. Plus, you can still jump to throw it to get your initial hit off in the air if desired as well. As for consistency, this is where things get a little bit more complicated, as this is not an easy weapon to handle. You really won't get the most out of this weapon without making good use of the sweet spot right at the apex of the throw, which is pretty close to the end of the screen. So close enemies are only going to take a couple of hits, as it's going to fly right through them and just keep on going until it returns. If you line things up correctly though, you will be slicing and dicing some poor bugs and can absolutely pump out damage. Another neat trick is that you can actually hit the Curveclaw back once on the return for a little bit of extra damage, or even pogo it downwards. Though I'd say this is a pretty niche use case, and you're probably better off just hitting your enemy with your needle instead. So ranking wise, I'd like to put it higher because of the ceiling for potential it has, but realistically, even a really good player is going to have relatively inconsistent results with this, especially against any enemy that's mobile. And no matter what, the damage ceiling on this is lower against enemies that are physically smaller and therefore unable to be hit more than 3 or 4 times per throw, so I'm only going to give this an A+. Even so, I think this is an incredible weapon to run, and it's very satisfying to use when mastered. Difficulty-wise though, I'd say this is a fair 8 out of 10 because it does require quite a bit of practice and discipline to properly use this to its fullest potential. I'll keep this one quick, as this is really just a tack onto the Curveclaw discussion, and that is the big brother of the Curveclaw, the Curvesickle, which can only be obtained in Act 3. You can watch this video next if you still don't have it to learn more about it and where to find it. This is pretty much just a massive DPS bump to the Curveclaw, bringing it up a whopping 70% and throwing a larger projectile. Nothing more to be said here in terms of how it would be used, but ranking-wise, it is rank 3 in both damage and DPS. And interestingly, the rank 1 and 2 spots for those categories are actually held by more than 2 different tools, as each of them falls short in one of the other categories in some capacity. So from an overall perspective, this is probably what I would describe as the strongest tool in the game once you've mastered it. Of course, it does still have the same shortcomings as the Curveclaw, where getting true max DPS off is very difficult, but because it has 70% more punch, I do think it's worthy of the S+ shot tier ranking, because in the places where it counts, like boss fights, it's almost always easy enough to obliterate them and get that 5 hits off per throw, especially if they're stunned. Once you get to Act 3, this is a great addition to your arsenal to start running. Same 8 out of 10 difficulty here as the Curveclaw though. Alright, so the throwing ring has got to be the biggest letdown of all tools in the game for me, but it does have 2 redeeming qualities. This weapon is tragically the absolute worst in terms of DPS and total damage, if you can believe it, though it can technically hit multiple enemies and actually has an enemy tracking system built into it that allows up to 2 ricochets to happen that will try to target nearby enemies, though it's very inconsistent. This does, however, bring its potential max damage and DPS up against clumps of enemies, and you can bounce the ring off a wall to have it target something above above you, which is a neat bit of utility, but it still doesn't make up for the fact that this only does a pitiful 14 damage per throw. Damage aside though, this is the coolest weapon in the game because as long as you have 2 rings left in your pouch, your taunt will be converted to a and you can even do this near shakra to get a reaction, which is pretty damn cool. Now normally your taunt would boost the damage of your next needle attack at the expense of 1 silk, but this changes it to not cost silk and instead buffs the damage of your next ring throw from 14 to 16. So either something between 10 and 15% bonus damage with some rounding, or it's literally just a flat 2 damage boost. But for all intents and purposes, that is absolutely useless dog shit. So sadly, this weapon is far from remarkable, but it's not quite as bad as I initially thought before properly understanding the ricochet tech. Even though it can multi-hit, the damage is just so atrocious that I really can't give this anything higher than a D+, because it's just so far behind the other tools that have better DPS while still being AoE too. I had initially given this the first F of shame, but we've now reserved that for 2 tools that are somehow even worse than this down the line. If you want to Pashanka all over Farloom, be my guest, but you'll likely be better off throwing the throwing ring into the abyss. 1 out of 10 difficulty wise, as it actually actively tries to help you with the ricochet tech. Next up is the Pimpillo, which is an interesting little weapon that has solid DPS but horrible total damage potential, making it incredibly expensive to operate. Interestingly though, it's actually been shadow buffed, as it used to only have 6 ammo capacity at max rank, but now it has 8. I don't know what Team Cherry's deal is with omitting these changes in the patch notes, as there's tons of cases of this happening, and it's pretty hard to keep track of what's changing, and I feel like I'm going insane when I see these alternate numbers popping up all over the place now. In any case, that bump to ammo capacity technically bumps the total damage up by 33%, but it still comes in at rank 20 for total damage, which is really bad. However, its DPS is actually rank 9. I think this is a reasonably versatile weapon, but with the caveat that it's mostly wasted on trash mobs and should only be used on stronger enemies or really annoying ones. It can damage through any attack, which is a solid plus, but if you throw them out too quickly, the first one that detonates will then blow up the other incoming one before it's close enough to damage your target, so you need to stagger your throws if the enemy is further away. So this is a bit of a hit against consistency, but it's easy to work around once you're aware of it. If you're point blank against an enemy though, you can just spam them and it'll be fine. I think this is a solid option for boss melting with guaranteed quick damage, but because the damage ceiling on it is really low despite the buff, I'd still only call this a B+ weapon, especially since the damage per shell shard is awful. Difficulty wise, I'd call it a 2 out of 10 since you need to be careful with how you toss it out, but it's pretty simple otherwise. The Conchcutter, a sad former shell of itself. This used to be one of the best tools in the game, particularly against thick enemies and piles of mobs, but it's since been nerfed to be destroyed after 6 hits against enemies for a total of 42 damage per throw, compared to being able to do 10 hits pre-nerf. Now it falls squarely in the middle at rank 13 for DPS and rank 11 in total damage, while having no AoE capacity outside of the fact that if the conch passes through an enemy before being destroyed, it will use its remaining charges on the next enemies in line. It's semi-versatile, though it's not perfect for airborne enemies since it throws at a downward angle, so you either have to get above your enemy before you throw, or you need to get your angle right from the bounce off the ground, which is easier said than done. With that in mind, I'd say its consistency is pretty average, as it can be tough to get even the 6 hits to all land against an enemy that isn't reasonably wide, and the 10 hits it used to be able to do were exclusively only possible against massive bosses or a large clump of lined up enemies. Unfortunately, I don't think I can really put this any higher than a B- at this point. There are simply much better options that function similarly, but are much more powerful, like the Curveclaw or Sickle, so there's little reason to run it. On top of not being very strong anymore, it's also one of the most difficult weapons to use at max potential due to the throwing angle shenanigans you have to deal with to ensure all hits land, so I'd call this a 7 out of 10 difficulty weapon. Alright, we've made it to the Silkshots, and first up is what I'd argue is the best one, mostly because it's Silksong's railgun and is cool as hell, but also because it's the only Silkshot that does AoE damage, but that doesn't mean it's actually good. If you're missing the Silkshot and want to know which is best for you, the same video for the Curvesickle location has everything you need to know about obtaining it there. The true Silkshot deals 34 damage per shot, which is the highest of all Silkshots, and pierces through enemies, but it's also the slowest to fire by a large margin, at only 1.2 shots per second. It also has the lowest ammo capacity, so despite its stronger shots, it's actually the worst in terms of total damage, coming in at rank 17, while its DPS is even worse and close to the bottom at rank 20. Yikes. Versatility wise though, I'd say it's pretty fair game anywhere, and if anything, it's especially good at general exploration as it can just blast through piles of trash mobs and performs pretty well in gauntlets too. However, we need to remember that for all silk shots, we're also being charged the silk tax to operate it, giving up 1 silk per shot, which really blows and brings down this weapon's ranking substantially. Consistency wise, it's pretty solid with a relatively easy to land beam, but you do have to get used to the charge up delay, which makes you somewhat vulnerable and makes hitting mobile enemies harder. Because of the AoE damage potential it has, I'm willing to call it a D+, and that's being generous because it's pretty lacking compared to the other AoE tools, and its single target damage is abysmal. It's a bummer that this is what I would say is the best silk shot and it's still getting this ranking. At least it looks cool, I guess. Difficulty here is probably a 3 due to the delay in firing you have to work around. The 12th Architect silk shot is up next, and this is arguably the worst silk shot of all in my opinion and should probably be renamed to the shit shot. It's got slightly better total damage than the true Silkshot, sitting at rank 14. We're talking literally 49 damage difference between the two, while its DPS has dropped down to rank 22, while needing more shots and therefore more silk to operate at the same amount of damage output, so this thing just sucks ass. It fires a 3-round burst that typically deals 10, 5, and then 3 damage per shot, so it does its base, then half of that, then presumably a third of the damage. But I've seen it hit for combos of 10, 10, 5, and possibly even triple 10s before, and it's either from enemies retreating or from being headshot, at least on the Grand Read. I'm not 100% sure, and I haven't been able to replicate it. For simplicity, I just used the 25 damage combo as the max damage number for the calculations to be extremely generous instead of the normal 18. And even then, it still ranked absolutely horribly, and it was honestly very rare to see it hit those numbers to begin with. It's got no AoE either, but I guess it's versatile in the sense that you can kill airborne enemies, bosses, and ground-bound enemies all equally slowly. Because it fires a 3-round burst that angles upwards, it's also not guaranteed to be consistent depending on the height of the enemy. This weapon is just not good, and you should really avoid making this silk shot if you can. I'm genuinely going to give this the F of shame, and this is the only one in the entire video that I think properly deserves it because it's already horrible at face value, and the additional silk operating costs are the final nail in the coffin. Difficulty is probably a 3 because you need to be somewhat thoughtful to land the burst against targets from a distance based on their size, and that's about it. The final silk shot is the Forge Daughter variant, and honestly, this one isn't horrible, but it's still not good. The damage is the highest of the 3, dealing 20 damage per shot and coming in at rank 12 in total damage, but only 19th for DPS while having no AoE potential. That's both a pro and a con that it has an ammo capacity of 30, as that's a lot of use you can get out of it between bench rests, but it's also 30 silk you have to cough up to operate it. This makes a good case for using the polyp pouch with it though, given how many shots can take advantage of it, and you get around a 20% damage boost by using it too, which is fair. Versatility wise, it's fine across the board and fires a nice straight, no nonsense shot that travels fast, making it pretty consistent to land all hits. Because it has slightly better DPS and a larger total damage potential than the true Silkshot, but lacking the AoE, I'll honestly also put it in the D+ tier, though I'd say it's still slightly below the true Silkshot. Sadly, none of these are very good options, and almost anything is going to be better than them, not even accounting for how detrimental the silk cost tied to operating them is. As for difficulty, I'd say this one's a 1 out of 10 as it's the most straightforward of the 3 to use and has nothing complicated to it, outside of perhaps getting tripped up by trying to fire it while having no silk available. Now, the Delver's Drill is a very neat tool that will probably surprise many people with how strong it actually is. While it sits at what I'd call an unremarkable DPS ranking at 14th place, this is actually the highest total damage potential tool in the entire game, with it being possible to deal over 1700 damage assuming perfect execution, but that's honestly damn near impossible to do. While you can technically hit a maximum of 7 times for 14 damage each or 98 damage per cast, this is very difficult to consistently achieve against mobile enemies and enemies that can parry, as it will cut the drill animation short, so you're far more likely to get somewhere closer to 2/3 of the damage off in a realistic scenario. But that's not even accounting for the fact that it's also just really difficult to land without being very deliberate about when you use it. This isn't something you can just go balls to the wall with like the Curvesickle. You need to position properly and at the right moment during enemies' attack patterns if you want to max the damage out, making this arguably the highest skill ceiling tool in the game. That being said, I'd say it's also the most versatile tool in the game because you can use it as an alternative pogo for platforming or drilling into enemies' heads instead of needle pogoing. I've covered this in more depth in another video, but you can pogo without using up weapon charges when you hit non-spike platforming structures, and you can actually hold the weapon button down to infinitely drill until you hit your first contactable surface outside of lava, thorns, and bile, making it significantly safer than free falling. It's also worth noting that you want to hold the weapon button down when attacking enemies with it, as you will cut the animation short if you don't, which will obviously tank the damage output. So this tool isn't perfect and certainly has consistency issues, while being on the low end in terms of the speed at which it pumps out damage, but I think it's very rewarding to use and actually feels really nice to have thrown into the mix during combat, despite the difficulty to pilot it while having an indisputably massive damage ceiling when mastered. I genuinely think that giving it an S- is fair, even with the shortcomings in combat, because it really is one of the only red tools in the game that provides additional utility outside of combat and is distinctly useful for anyone who doesn't like the Hunter, Beast, or Architect Crest Pogo due to their horizontal momentum. As for difficulty, I think it's legitimately a 9 out of 10 because it's very, very difficult to use this effectively in combat without a good deal of practice, and just about any fast-moving enemy is going to be quite tricky to use on this initially. The Cogwork Wheel is not a great weapon, but it's not horrible either. Personally though, I think it's a massively overrated, shittier version of the Conchcutters. It's nearly identical to them in terms of function, in that it is cast out and will deal damage a fixed number of times before being destroyed, only it throws out wheels that you can only cast on the ground, and they break after doing 7 hits instead of 6, while doing 7 damage per hit, for a max of 49 per cast. This is marginally higher than the Conchcutters, and will bring it to rank 11 in terms of DPS, and 8th in total damage per set, which is not bad, but the issue is that you will very rarely, if ever, be able to get full DPS off on bosses, as very few bosses are wide enough to be hit all 7 times in a cast. For general exploration at least, this is a different story, as small clumps of 2 to 3 grounded enemies can be sawn through without wasting many hits, making them slightly better there, but let's not forget the fact that these cannot be used on airborne enemies, which I think is a massive hit against it. Even though the Tacks do a decent amount of damage less than the wheels while also being a ground-only tool, they were at least almost guaranteed damage, where I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to get more than 50% damage output from these against most bosses. So they aren't the worst weapon by any measure, but because they are quite restricted in their versatility and are difficult to get consistent damage with, I think a C+ just behind the Conchcutters is fair, as they're at least a little stronger than them, but don't have the capacity to hit airborne enemies, which holds them back a fair bit. I think the Tacks fill the ground-bound enemy niche better, at least for bosses, while you have better heavy hitters like the Curveclaw to work with by the time you even get far enough in the game to use these to begin with, so it's just not a compelling pick in my eyes. Difficulty-wise, I call them a 3 out of 10 because while it's difficult in itself to get consistent damage, that's more related to the weapon being limited in its capabilities against specific enemies. Otherwise, it's quite straightforward to use. Just make sure an enemy is on the ground and ideally not moving towards you to maximize damage. The Cogflies, some of the most wondrous mechanical creatures of Farloom, though sadly, another victim of Team Cherry's nerf hammer in more ways than one. Previous nerfs directly listed in the patch notes made it so that the Cogflies no longer regenerate HP upon changing scenes, which in fairness was an appropriate nerf as it didn't make sense that that would happen to begin with, but they actually shadow nerfed them as well to only deal up to 5 instances of 10 damage per fly, down from 6, which is a pretty substantial hit to what was already a very low total damage tool coming in at rank 22, nearly at the very bottom. However, when we talk about DPS potential, they are much higher up, hitting rank 10 if you were to loose them during an active fight, but if you were to actually cast a set of 4 of them before being in combat, you could actually say that their DPS doubles and ends up being almost the highest in the game, as cast time is what actually determines DPS here, not the rate at which the flies do the damage itself. These bad boys are pretty much useful anywhere in the game, with the caveat that they can be destroyed by some enemy attacks, so they'll prove less effective against certain bosses than others, but are generally great. Outside of being destroyable, you're pretty much guaranteed to get the full 50 damage off from each fly you toss out, and it's great set it and forget it damage that lets you focus on neo combat instead of lining up perfect shots like some other weapons require. They also have one of the best synergies with the Polyp Pouch in the game, if you're willing to slowly let your flies free instead of releasing them in sets of 4. Since poison won't stack, if you have just one fly out, it'll proc the poison, and then tick the poison, and then reapply it with every single hit, giving you between 30 and 60% bonus damage per fly based on how fast it gets its next hit in. The final point in favor of the Cogflies is that they are far and away the safest tool in the game to use, to the point where you can literally just not interact with enemies outside of only focusing on dodging while the flies do the work, making these incredibly useful in Steel Soul runs or doing delivery tasks like the Liquid Lacquer or Gourmand quest. The final phases of bosses can become quite a lot easier as well if you're having trouble with them, and you can again just be more focused on surviving while the flies finish the job. Though I'd say generally just going ham with a full set of Curveclaws or another high burst tool would do a better job in most cases if you can tank a hit while you go nuclear. In spite of the pros the flies provide, the total damage output is still a massive detractor, so as much as I love these little guys, it's hard to put them in the S tier since the damage nerf and the justifiable nerf to their HP regen tech. But I will give them an A+ because the safety they can provide is pretty unique and valuable. Difficulty-wise, they're another 1 out of 10, with the only skill-related aspect being knowing when to throw them if an enemy has abilities that could destroy them. Alright, the Rosary Cannon was formerly what I believe to be the worst weapon in the game, but this has also undergone a shadow buff treatment since release that has made it at least somewhat more valid to use. Psych, even with the buffs, this thing is still absolute dog shit. Pre-buff, the Rosary Cannon would only do a pathetic 3 damage per shot, but now it seems like it's possible to do up to 7 damage per hit, though it's not guaranteed, and it's either related to hitting headshots or something else that I don't quite understand, because I've had very weird moments where it'll go 50-50 on 7 and 3 damage hits, and other times where I get more 7s than normal. I don't know, it's a little murky, but if someone knows exactly what's causing this variance, I'd love to hear your explanation. In any case, I've decided to do my ranking for the cannon using an average of 5.5 per shot, so just over that 50-50 7 and 3 balance to be generous, which brings it up to rank 18 for both DPS and total damage, which is still pretty bad, but not as bad as the Architect Silkshot or Straight Pin theoretically, but in practice you'll see that this is actually way worse than you would have thought. Not only does it have a 1/3 of a second spin up time before your first shot gets fired, but you also can't move once you start firing it, making airborne shots difficult if not impossible in most cases to pull off. The best you can do is change directions from left to right rapidly to spray above you erratically.
Suppressing fire!
The quick sling is also pretty stupid here, as all it does is decrease the wind-up time to around 1/5 of a second, but the fire rate remains the same otherwise. Now technically you can milk double damage from every shot with the polyp pouch when you space your shots long enough, but because of the wind-up time, it's completely unjustifiable to use this way, so don't waste a blue slot on either of these tools for this. All in all, this is pretty bad no matter how you slice it, and the fact that it also costs rosaries to operate is another detractor, as the conversion rate for maxed out weapons is 50 rosaries per full reload versus 80 with the cannon, so you're paying 60% more just to operate this thing. If money ain't no thing, then go ahead and use this, but I do think it is worthy of our second F of shame, and I'm gonna put it underneath the Architect skill shot, as it has a much longer list of negatives tied to using it. The high operating cost, horrid damage, the inability to move while firing, on top of being impossible to use in the air effectively, and finally an incredibly long windup time makes this absolutely atrocious, and I would say it is indeed the worst weapon in the game. I'd also call it a 3 out of 10 in difficulty, as you need to find windows with enough uninterrupted time to wind it up properly to start doing meaningful damage with it. Back to a more positive note, we made it to the Voltvessels, which are one of my favorite weapons personally. They're a very fun to use weapon that packs a punch, has some neat secret interactions, and has 2 forms. We'll talk about the spear version first here. After staking the Voltvessel, you'll deal up to 6 instances of 10 damage in a quick but explosive burst of electricity, in a column that can also be redirected 45 degrees if you hit it with your needle or another projectile, making it easier to hit airborne and distant enemies. If you're right on top of an enemy, staking it through them will deal an additional 17 damage, which is a solid boost and can bring this version of the Voltvessels up to rank 8 in terms of DPS and 9th in total damage output, which is very solid in both respects, especially considering it has massive AoE potential. I'd say getting close to full damage off with this is incredibly easy, though it is a touch harder to ensure you're getting the staking damage bonus if that's something you care about. It's very versatile, working in almost any combat scenario, and is great for clearing clusters of mobs even if they're airborne. In a lot of cases, the damage is a little overkill, but I don't really mind. You can also throw these into the water and get an instant detonation while cascading electric damage across the water in addition to the standard damage column it produces, which is pretty cool, albeit a niche use case. I personally love pairing this with the Curvesickles, as you can plant them, then immediately throw a Curvesickle to redirect it, which saves you a needle hit you otherwise would have had to do to reposition it, and you get a massive burst of damage from the combo. I think the Quick Sling is also distinctly useful here too, as the time save on double staking while only needing to hit it once to reposition both is also a tangible benefit. I'm willing to give this an S-, but not any higher, but only because it does trail a reasonable bit behind the other top tools, but the AoE potential and the reliability of it is definitely a strong selling point, on top of it just being a very fun tool to use. Difficulty wise though, I'd call it a 4, as the staking damage bonus is harder to land consistently and is definitely more risky, but general use without trying to get that is probably only a 3 out of 10, with the only difficulty being that there's a short delay between planting and the actual explosion going off, so some quicker enemies can reposition before hit if you don't time it right. Now for the Bolas version, and while I initially did say this was stronger in a previous video, I didn't realize how much stronger it actually is when you properly max out its potential. This version throws a pair of electric orbs that deal 5 contact damage, and shortly after hitting something will trigger a detonation of 4 hits of 10 damage each, making it possible to deal 85 damage or even 90 per hit. Though we'll use 85 as I've rarely seen both orbs actually contact before. Now here's the kicker. Similar to the Pimpillos, you can create a chain reaction for the explosions if you throw a new set of Bolas into an already detonating Voltvessel, making it instantly pop. So if a boss is stationary during a combo or is stunned, you can just toss all of your Voltvessels and they will go absolutely ballistic. Like, you can barely tell what the hell is going on with all of these exploding. It's so powerful that this is in fact the highest DPS tool in the game, hitting 201 DPS without even using the quick sling, which is frankly obscene. Assuming you hit all 10 Voltvessels, which honestly wouldn't be that difficult, you would have nuked over 800 HP in 4 seconds, and you could easily just craft find another set and do it all over again, which would kill literally almost any boss in the game. Throw the quick sling into the mix and you get to do that even faster. I will say that you generally have to be standing right in front of your target to do this, or the instant detonation of the Voltvessel can be too far to register the damage, but you seriously could just face tank while doing this and you'd probably kill whatever you're fighting right away. It's just that strong. I'd say this is a bit harder to use in general exploration, as you typically only have 1 ball hit enemies, but it is AoE and can cover a large area, so it's still fair play, just harder to get consistent results with. But with how insane this is against bosses, I still think this has to be given the S+ Shaw tier ranking, because this kind of DPS should not be possible in the game, and it feels like borderline cheating with how strong it is. Difficulty wise, I'll bump this up to a 5 out of 10, mostly for using it well in general exploration, but partly in learning to use it point blank against bosses safely to maximize DPS while minimizing damage. Getting close to the end, we're on Flintslate now, and this one was a very interesting one to rank, as measuring damage potential on it is a little more tricky. So originally, you get 11 bonus damage per needle hit no matter what with this at max rank, but it's since been changed to give you a 50% damage buff to needle damage, but only against your base needle damage. So other modifiers like Beast Fury and Wanderer focus stacks will scale additively with it, not multiplicatively. Charge attacks will benefit from the full 50% though. I've left some numbers up on the screen here if you're interested in how the damage actually gets calculated. It lasts 8 seconds, but it also has a 1.1 second cast time, which is pretty long and is important to factor in for DPS purposes. But you can use it as an animation stall to stay floating in the air for a moment, just like normal binding, which can be clutch in some rare cases, so that's neat. While active, you can also burn enemies, though it's not 100% clear if there's a true rule to how many hits are required to apply it. The wiki claims it's every 3rd hit, but I know for a fact that I've had it apply after 2 attacks and after 5 many times, so I assume it builds up to a 100% chance at 5 hits, but averages out around 3.5. Otherwise though, if we think about what the max damage output of a single cast of Flintslate would be, we simply have to look at what the max damage output of each crest is over the course of 8 seconds. Now technically these numbers on screen are the theoretical maxes if you hit literally every single possible hit in 8 seconds, and I've assumed you could apply the burn 5 times for 60 damage, but let's be realistic. Even if you get a great scenario where you're wailing on a boss and then they get stunned, you're very likely to be missing quite a few windows to deal damage while they move, or you're dodging their attacks. So to try and evaluate things more fairly, I've made the assumption that you could hit 2/3 of the theoretical max in an actual fight for calculation purposes of a practical absolute max. This is different from other tools as the clock is constantly running down even during moments where a boss is essentially impossible to attack, so I think adjusting this practical maximum was appropriate. Even still, you'd be shocked to find that this would actually shift the rankings of almost every single tool in the game down by 1, as it comes out at 1st in terms of DPS and 2nd for total damage, only barely falling behind the Delver Drill's theoretical max. Though this is specifically for the Wanderer and Fury Beast Mode crest using it due to their massive attack speeds, which gets the most benefit out of this obviously. The baseline Hunter and Beast fall just a touch below that, and then a bit more with the Witch, but surprisingly, even for the slowest candidates, the Reaper and Architect, you'd still be able to hit rank 4 DPS and total damage using Flintslate. This was a pretty surprising result, and I wasn't sure how it would stack up to the other tools, but it really is hella strong, and you could easily justify using it on just about any crest if you're more of a needle purist. Just know that you are playing with fire when it comes to consistency, because sometimes you will get absolutely shafted by an enemy going into a crazy set of moves where you just can't get a hit in for more than half of the duration. When things work out well though, you can absolutely pop off, especially when things line up with a stun on a boss, giving you without a doubt the greatest total damage for a single tool use of anything in the game by a significant margin. Take this with a giant grain of salt though when I talk about DPS, as this calculation is again going against the time you spend activating the Flintslate and not the actual needlework of the weapon. So you won't be exploding an enemy as fast as the Bolas Voltvessels, but you would technically output more damage per second spent doing the action required to access the damage, which in this case is that 1.1 second activation time. So it's mildly misleading, but hopefully the logic makes sense here. I think one other fair criticism against the Flintslate is that it isn't particularly conducive to use in most general exploration, as enemies are too spread out to get great value from it. And it's also very inefficient to use charge attacks compared to spamming basic needle attacks with this, so that is another hit against it. However, you get the opposite effect that the Silkshots had, in that you're gaining silk by using this tool, which does have legitimate value. You can use this on literally any crest, just about anywhere, but boss fights are where it will really light things up. So all things considered, I'm only going to place this in the S- tier, but not any higher despite the massive ceiling for damage potential, as it doesn't have any innate AoE potential, doesn't help hit enemies from a distance, and is massively variable in performance, with it often not being possible to get more than a few hits off during an activation. When it does work, the damage is off the charts, but the likelihood of having enough opportunities to fully capitalize on this during a boss fight is incredibly low. I'd say difficulty to master this is probably a 7 out of 10 because you really do need to time your activations correctly, on top of having the skill to consistently land enough basic attack hits to get meaningful value out of it, which I think is fair. High skill ceiling and risk, but definitely high reward. Also, a few final neat things about the Flintslate is that you will immediately extinguish it when going into water, and it produces steam in the hot springs area with the showers, so that's kind of cool. You can also use it with the polyp pouch to gain the poison ability, and it'll extend the duration from 8 seconds to 10 seconds. However, it will have the damage boost to 25% and removes the burn effect, so it's really not worth using ever, in my opinion. It's actually a straight nerf. We're almost at the end here, and we've reached probably a lesser understood tool, just given how little use most people get out of it, and the fact that it's kind of the only real temporary tool in the game. The Snaresetter can be used up to the end of Act 2 since it disappears going into Act 3, and it costs 1 silk to operate in exchange for laying a trap that deals 85 damage in a decently large area when triggered. Unfortunately, it has a very long cast time, and it brings the DPS potential of this very low to rank 16, though its total damage potential is actually very high, sitting at rank 5. The only circumstance where you get a little more DPS value out of this would be maybe the first Trobio fight, the Cogwork dancers during a phase transition, and maybe something else that behaves similarly, since you have dead time to place the traps, which you can place a maximum of 4 of at once. But outside of that, this thing kind of sucks. There is an alternative method to using this, which I think is kind of funny, but it's actually legitimately better DPS than using it as intended, and that's by doing what I call the head popper method. You can basically use this just like the Delver's drill, but instead of multiple drill hits, you get 2 pops of 24 damage per snare, and you can spam it pretty quickly while also using it as a pogo if you really wanted to, but it does use up a charge no matter what. This still isn't great though, and it comes in at rank 12 on damage and 16th for total damage if we wanted to rank it, so you get a lot less value out of it, but it is a funny way to use it. Generally, I think this weapon just isn't worth running, and it's a lot more annoying to set up than just tossing out Tacks if you wanted to queue up a set it and forget it type of damage, while also being too overkill for most general exploration situations. It's also pretty dangerous to set up in boss fights, as it takes almost 1.5 seconds just to set 1 snare, which is even longer than a multi-binder heal, so even with its large damage potential, this just doesn't make it conducive to use in boss fights in my opinion. I call it a C tier weapon to be honest, and I think you're a lot better off using something else than this. I'd say difficulty is a 5 out of 10 given the risk associated with use and requiring careful timing to safely plant one without being hit. Second to last on the list is the Golden Elixir, our beloved Fleabrew. I can't believe my ridiculous notion that this was boiled fleece sparked a giant discussion about what it could be. I definitely like the flea piss and flea bathwater theories the best from what I've read so far. This magical yellow liquid comes in limited vintages acquired from our friends at the Flea Caravan, and they'll boost your attack speed by 20% on the Wanderer and Witch Crest, 25% on the Hunter, Reaper, and Beast Crest, and 33% on the Architect Crest. Now these are different numbers than you may have previously heard in other videos, including my own, and that's because yet another tool has been changed, and so have some crests. I'm going to break this down in more detail in another video, but let's just leave it at this. Team Cherry has been meddling with way more stats in the back end than I think anyone realizes, and I just haven't seen anyone talking about this, so I'll try and shed some more light on all of these soon. In any case, Fleabrew has a relatively meaningful effect on your ability to dish out damage, and each charge lasts for 10 seconds, making it possible to gain around 75 to 110 extra damage per brew at a max rank needle, assuming perfect max hits the entire duration, depending on the crest. However, as we've discussed with Flintslate, that is very unlikely to happen, so you'd maybe expect to get 50 to 75 damage per actual cast, which is really not that great in my opinion. That would put it almost dead last in terms of total damage, though DPS would be in the top half of tools. And we're not even accounting for the fact that Fleabrew is quite limited, so active use of it is tough to justify, as the time spent going to refill it would further negate the time saving it could create. But it does provide you with a nifty little move speed boost of about 25%. Otherwise, I think this is not a great tool in terms of what it directly provides. But there is a silver lining to this tool. Again, similar to Flintslate, it'll help up your silk generation, which can mean more silk skills or more healing, which I think we should factor into the overall efficacy of the tool. And in this case, you actually get additional attacks compared to baseline, whereas Flintslate only amps attacks you were going to already do. Another saving grace here is that it is incredibly cheap to use and eventually becomes completely free, so you could just use it for some low to no cost tool benefits and just accept that you won't have any once it runs out until you naturally return to the Flea Caravan to progress their questline. I would say it's really only something that should be used in boss fights, but you really could use it anywhere, you just aren't likely to max out its potential in normal exploration. If we were to just rank what it provides outside of silk generation being factored in, I would have called this a D tier tool, but honestly, if you think about it, it is a pretty legitimate pro that gives you flexibility to heal or do more damage in a fight without making things overly complicated with throwing tools, so I'm actually willing to bump this up to a B+, as a conversion to silk skill damage can definitely bring things up a significant amount. Difficulty wise, this isn't rocket science, but you will need to deal with more knockback when using this, and so you'll need to use the weighted belt to help counteract that, or just be more disciplined with your spacing, so let's call it a 2 out of 10. One final interesting thing is that the Pollet pouch will turn you into Singe from League of Legends when you pop a Fleabrew, leaving a poisonous trail behind you as you run while it's active, but it's pretty useless to be honest, so I wouldn't even bother with this. We have finally made it to the end here with the Plasmium Phial. This is obviously not an offensive tool, so DPS calculations are thrown out the window here, but it is an interesting utility tool that is particularly good on the Architect Crest, given the ease of forcing the overdose mechanic on it, which I've discussed a few times in other videos already. Before you get the upgraded version of it, it's not really something you can ever actively use, as the reserve charges are quite low, but when it is upgraded, it becomes pretty viable for use on the Architect Crest regularly if regenerating HP and healing through Plasmium is your preference. It's great for platforming, can provide a good cushion for the start of boss fights, or a clutch heal during one, but I wouldn't really say it's good for general exploration outside of platforming sections, unless it's through the overdose mechanic. I will say that it can be a cool thing to pair with the Witch or Beast Crest, which have arguably more painful healing methods, but you will need to be willing to go near the wormways to get your first few Plasmium masks loaded up before injecting yourself to OD with them, as it's impossible otherwise. Once you rest at a bench or fast travel though, this goes away, so it's really a full commit option, and you won't be recharging your other red tools once it's gone if you do this, since there's no benching. And if you die, you're probably gonna have a very long walk of shame back to your cocoon. It's very niche, but an interesting option for those who want to try it. Pre-upgrade, I'd really only call it a B tier tool, given how much of a pain in the ass it is to refill, but in Act 3, once upgraded and with the Architect Crest, I'd say it's a fair play A tier tool for survivability. Plus, with 3 red tool slots on the crest anyways, you still have more than enough options for damage. It's still pretty niche regardless though, and I really don't see a lot of people getting much use out of this, outside of maybe wanting it as a safety net for the Widow's Peak climb, the Cogwork core, or maybe Biowater if you acquire this before clearing it. It also could be a strong consideration for safety during a Steel Soul run if you needed it. There's really no difficulty in using this, so I'm not going to assign a rank for that, but there is an interesting interaction with the Polyp pouch here that makes you explode all of your existing Plasmium masks, but it's absolute dog shit and literally only does the base poison tick damage while making you lose your bonus HP. So it's pretty stupid, but it's interesting, I guess. Damn, we have somehow made it to the end here, and some of the results really surprised me. With the numerous nerfs and minor buffs, there was definitely a noticeable reordering in my rankings from what I had initially planned when I first started making notes for this video. Some big takeaways are that Flintslate is still incredibly strong even after the changes. The Voltvessels in Bolas form and the Slingshot are absolutely monstrous in terms of immediate DPS, and the Curvesickle is nasty for long range big damage potential. On the flip side, the Rosary Cannon, Throwing Ring, Straight Pin and 12th Architect Shitshot are all pretty god-awful, but at least the Straight Pin is justified for being bad since it's the first tool in the game. Everything else falls somewhere in between, with the Cogflies and Tacks still providing great safety with set it and forget it type damage despite their nerfs, while Fleabrew appears mid at face value but is actually kinda good. The Delver's Drill provides some unique utility with its pogo and infinity drill tech, while the Plasmium Phial ODing also has a unique niche for survivability. Finally, while many tools have insane ceilings for total damage potential, the consistency in doing so and the speed at which they can deliver it is clearly another story based on what we've seen. All in all though, there are lots of really strong options to choose from when it comes to tools in Silksong, so you'll never go especially wrong with what you pick. Unless it's the Rosary Cannon. That thing is absolute trash. And if you're a needle purist and don't want to use tools at all, no one's holding a Silkshot to your head making you use them. So just use whatever feels fun to you, and if the going gets tough, 20 Voltvessel balls should fix everything. Thank you again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check it out for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile using my links in the description or pinned comment. If you're someone who's been enjoying the explosive power of red tools in Silksong, then you'll enjoy blowing up vehicles in the most comprehensive vehicular combat game around. Whether you're a new or returning player who's coming back after a break of at least 6 months, you'll receive a colossal bonus pack on PC and consoles, including 3 premium vehicles, 100k silver lions, a 50% boost for XP and silver, and 7 days of premium account and more to get right into the action. Let me know in the comments what your favorite tools have been in Silksong, or drop that shaw for the algorithm gods. If you somehow made it through this, then you might enjoy an hour of insanely detailed Crest analysis in this next video here. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.